Hey, welcome back guys. So in the last video, we installed the MariaDB 10.5 community version on two VMs, and we also played around with the concept of OS authenticated user accounts using the Unix socket plugin that now comes pre-installed with the MariaDB server. Previously, you would need to install this separately, but now it comes built-in. That started with the all the enterprise versions and 10.4 and now 10.5 of course. Alright, so the next thing we are going to do is we are going to be creating a replication link between the two servers. Now we know for sure that our servers are totally empty, but before even doing that, what we have to do is we will have to do some cleanup, because last time we did create some user accounts, and then we did create some tables that we don't want to have in the server. So we'll have it as totally empty machine, and then we'll see what are the steps required if we want to enable replication between two new servers. But this is going to be a totally new setup, of course. So the process is slightly different if you are running it on a new machine, but the process again is slightly different if you already have a server that is already running MariaDB server, and then you want to add a new slave or new replica to that primary server, right? So let's take a quick look at it. So I am currently connected as the same DBA1 user account that we had last time. So I'm going to quit from here and just going to go to, oops, I think I need to exit back to root account. Yeah, and I will log in back to MariaDB account, and then we'll say drop user DBA1 at localhost and drop database test. We don't want to have those things in our environment. So now we should have the defaults that are there in this machine. But before even doing that, let's do the first thing that we should have done after we install a new MariaDB server. That is the MariaDB secure installation, right? So that is the first thing that we should have done. MariaDB secure installation. Because it's a new installation, we don't have a root password, and our root user is already tied to MariaDB using Unix socket, so we don't need to give any password here. So just press enter, and then it's going to ask you please enter the current password for root. We don't have a password, so we just press enter here. No need to type anything at all, just press enter. And it's saying, do you want to switch to Unix authentication socket? Even though it's already switched, we will just say yes. And is saying that your root account is already protected. Do you want to set a root password as well? So that can be helpful if, let's say, you are logged in as an other user on the OS, but you want to connect to the root user on the database. So I guess it's good to have a password. So let's say let's define that password now. So I've already given a password from a root user. So in case previously, you remember when we did the show create user for root at localhost, it said that my user account has an invalid or no password at all. So it's only authenticated against the user Unix socket. So now we will have both password plus Unix socket authentication. And then now it's saying, do you want to remove the anonymous user? We will just say yes. So again, you'll see that this Y is an uppercase, so that's the default value. So you don't have to press Y here. I can just press enter here, and again disallow root user login remotely. That's also always a good idea to do. Yes, we don't want the root user to be connecting from a remote terminal. Remove the test database. We have already removed it, but yeah, why not? We can just press enter here. Read your privilege table, yes, why not? All right, so now our server is secure. So if I do MariaDB now, we can still connect because we are root user and our root is authenticated via Unix socket. And if I do show create user root at localhost, you will see something new now that identified via MySQL native password, and then we have a password now. Previously it was showing as invalid, if you remember. And yeah, and also we can authenticate via Unix socket. Previously it was only authenticated via Unix socket and no password. So how this will work now is, let's say if we are maybe using the DBA1 account, right? And then I know the root password, and I want to connect to the database as a root user. I don't want to switch my user here on the OS, but I can always connect to the database using the root user now, because I have a password authentication as well. So I'll just say MariaDB -u root. If I do that, it's not going to work, because now we have a password, right? And also this syntax would expect that my OS user is also root, which is not currently. So I would have to pass in additional parameter as -p for password. I'll press enter. It's going to prompt me for the password. I will just type it in, and then we should be able to go inside now. And then now we'll see, select user, and there it is. We are connected to root user, but we connected through the DBA1 account, right? All right, great. So that settles it. So we'll go back to the root user account, and yeah, so now we have already secured our server, so we don't have those unsecure things like anybody can log into the database, or anonymous accounts, or the test database and all that stuff. We don't have that anymore. So now the first thing we have to do now regarding our replication setup is to create a user account. So now I think we don't need to repeat this stuff, or I'm sorry, so sorry about that. I think the best thing to do would be quit from here and edit our server config file, right? So that should have been the first thing that we do when we want to set up a replication, even before we create a replication user account. So this is your default server.cnf file location on a CentOS 7 or Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So I'm going to edit this file. So we will scroll. You can either put it here under this MySQLD section, but generally I would use the MariaDB section for all the MariaDB related configurations, right? So press. So the first thing I'm going to do is we are going to enable error logging. So the first parameter is log error, right? So you can give a file name here, and also a path here where you want the file to be created, or where you want the logs to be created. But I'm not going to do that. I'll just leave it as it is. So what this would do is this will use the data directory for logging, which is not a good idea. So always create a separate folder, but just for the sake of this video, I'm just going to leave it as it is. And then the next parameter would be log bin to enable binary logs. So you will see that I am enabling this binary logs on both machines, right? So this is important because at any given time we can have this node as a master primary server, or this node as a primary server. So we need to have binary logs enabled on both machines. Keep that in mind. And in this case, it's a good idea to give a separate path to this thing, but because it's my test VM, so I don't really care about that much. So but I'm going to give a file name to this this thing. So I'll just say as MariaDB bin. That's it. So it is going to, again, another rule of thumb is that for all the parameters that require a path or a file name, if you don't give that, right, if you don't define the path, some will ask for a file name. At least a minimum requirement is a file name, but some parameter will take meaning. For example, this log bin and log errors, you don't need to define a file or a path name at all. But if you do define a file name without a path, it is going to go into the data directory, right? So that's where I want everything to go for now, because it's not so serious for my particular setup. All right. So this is done. My bin logs are enabled now on my both of my machines. Another thing I would want to do is log slave updates equals to 1. So I will enable log slave updates. So what this is going to do is on the slave node, whichever is my replica, whenever the data gets replicated from primary to the replica, that data also gets recorded as on its own bin logs as slave updates, right? And this is super important if you want to have another server that is going to replicate off of this particular server. So is just keep that in mind. So whenever you want to have a node that is going to have slaves in the future, or you want to set up further slaves of that particular node, even though that node is a slave or a replica, you can still have further replicas of that particular node that is basically replicating off of that particular node. So in that case, you would always want to enable log slave updates for every single node. That's going to be super helpful later on. All right, so this is done. I think we don't need to worry about a lot of other stuff at this point in time. I think these are the bare minimum requirements. So log errors is the one. The first thing we need to have is to log errors. Then the second thing is enable bin logs, and then slave updates. Oh yeah, how can I forget? We need to have a server ID. Server ID equals to 1000, for example. But now I cannot use the same server ID on more than one machines. So in this machine, normally I would just set up as 2000. It can be any integer number, so it's up to you. You can just simply say 1 and 2, that's also fine, but I just like to have it as 1000, 2000, 3000, like that. So that looks and makes more sense to me, at least. So server ID is something that is supposed to be unique on all the nodes, right? So wherever we are setting up replication, those server IDs are supposed to be unique on every single VM or every single server. So I'm going to broadcast to all of the machines again, and let's say we'll save and exit. And if I go to my data directory, varlib MySQL, you will see that this is my data directory. I don't see any error file or any binary logs at the moment, right, on both servers. So let's do a restart of my MariaDB server. Oops. Restart MariaDB, and there you go. So we have a restart. So we all know that when we have bin logs and error logs enabled, when you do a restart, we would see those files created immediately. So if we do the listing of this folder now, and yes, sure enough, we can see my hostname.err file here. That is my error log file. And then we can also see MariaDB-bin. This is my first binary log that is created by default, right? Okay, so we are good to go for as far as the replication setup is concerned. Okay, so now we know that our bin logs are enabled. So I am going to break my broadcasting. I don't want to broadcast to both sides anymore. So we will just go here, and then I'm going to create a new user that we are going to be using for our replication. Yeah, create user. Let's say we call it replication user at let's say I give it a % for now. So % means that this user can connect from any machine, but I think it's not a very good idea to do that. So we will give it a specific IP address. If I can type correctly, that will help a lot. So 196.168.56. Yeah, this sounds good, because my IP addresses are 192. It should be 192, 168.56, and this particular node is 71, and this particular node is 72. So having a % here makes more sense. So that meaning this user basically can come in from this subnet, and the ending number can be anything. Okay, that sounds good. identified by, I'm just going to give a very simple password for now. Alright, so my user is created with the password as password, very secret password. Yeah, and you shouldn't follow this. Alright, so this is done, and now the another important thing is, of course, we want to give necessary privileges to this user so that it can basically replicate. So what are those? Grant replicate slave, grant replicate slave on star.star to replicate user at 192.160.26.person. I think it should be replication slave, not replicate slave. Yeah, there it is. So grant replication slave on star.star to my replication user. Okay, so show grants for this guy. Yep, so I have grant replication slave on star.star, meaning all the databases and all the tables within those databases, and of course I have a password as well for this user. Okay, I think we are done for now. So now you would assume that we already have bin logs enabled. So if we check for show binary logs, we can see that my current binary log is this one, and then my binary log position is something, of course, is not the default position, that is I think 300 something. So it's not the default anymore, so meaning that this create user command and then this grant command have already been recorded in my binary logs on this particular server. So when we set this slave up or set this replica up, starting from the very first bin log entry, so we would end up repeating these commands like create user command and grant command on the other server as well, right? So yeah, so let's do a quick check. So we will go back here, and we are currently in the data directory folder, right? And yeah, so this is my file. So how can you read the contents of a bin log, right? So this is another super important thing that everybody should know. So MySQL bin log is your friend, -v to verbose output, and then this particular file. And so of course you can do a less here or something else. All right, so this is how your bin log starts. So just ignore the first part, and we'll just skip, and you can see we have a particular position here. I think we need to go slightly up. Yeah, so this is my position here at 372. This is my bin log position at 372. My first command that is executing is this create user command, right? So identified by password. And then similarly, of course, you would have a grant command as well, right? So all those things are there, and yeah, I think we are good to go. And you can also see my GTID, the global transaction ID, which is super important for our MariaDB replication setup, that we need to know the GTIDs as well. So the GTID for my first command is 001, right? So this command, that create table command, is 001, and my grant is basically on GTID 002, right? So you can say that this is a DDL as well. So this is a grant command, and that is basically existing on the GTID 002. Okay, this is one way of finding out your global transaction IDs for individual or specific commands, but it can become very messy if you have a lot of bin logs. If you have a very busy server, then it can get a bit messy. So the easiest way is you can just say show master status, right? So your master status will tell you where your current where your primary server is at right now. So this is your bin log file name, and this is your position. Now there is a way to find out this position, and this file and this position represents which global transaction ID. That is something that is super important. So bin log, so we know the bin log. So I always keep forgetting this stuff, right? So is it binlog gdid position, or is it gdid binlog position? So there's a function that gives us that. So how I remember this is that we know the binlog position and binlog file name, and I want to find the gtid. So the function name would follow the same logic, right? So it should be binlog underscore gdid underscore position. So this is the function name, and the first parameter to this function is your file name, your binlog file name, and then your position, that is 675, right? So we put a semicolon here. I'm selecting the data now, and there you go. We can see that this represents the same gtid position that we saw earlier on in the MySQL binlog output. So my current gtid position for my server is 0. 0 is a domain name because we did not set any domain for our setup, and that's why 0. That doesn't matter. The second number is my server ID, which of course can be understandable that this command we are running is on the server ID 1000. So that's why the server ID 1000 is showing here. And then the last digit in my global transaction ID represents the number of transaction, or the current transaction, actual transaction number. So far it means that so far on this particular server we have executed 2 commands. One is to create the user account, and the second command we executed here is to grant some privilege to that user account. So that is why we can see that we have this particular gtid 01002, right? But of course on this machine, show master status, this is the default value, right? 330. So whenever you have a fresh server, or if you, let's say you reset your master status, then you will get back to this starting position. So we can run the same command here, select binlog gtid position, and with this file name I should have a single quote here, and 330, let's see, is currently empty. Because why? Because we have not executed, or we haven't done anything on this particular server yet. That's why it's empty, which is a good thing, because we are setting up a slave. We shouldn't be doing stuff on the slave or the replica node, and even after the replication is set up, we should never be doing any transaction on the slave. That is the first rule of having a successful replica setup. All right, so my grant is done. So my grant is done. The second thing we would want to do is, now we know that, okay, so now we know that my gtid on the master is 2000, is 1000-2. So what happens that if we set up the slave, and that slave needs to follow this number, that would mean that the slave would replicate from this number onwards. So it would not get any of the things that have already been done before this number, which is not what we want. We want this slave to start replicating from the very first gtid, right? So for that, the first thing we have to do is set global gtid binlog position, or rather slave position, is empty. So we will set this up as empty position. Oops, something wrong. Yeah, set global. All right, so my global gtid slave position is set to empty now, so meaning we don't have a global position. And now we can set up our replication right away. Okay, so what's the command? The command is a bit confusing if you're doing it for the first time, but when you look at it and when I explain it to you, then you will realize that it's not so difficult after all. So the command is change master to, right? So when we say change master to, meaning we are telling this particular server, we are telling this server that I want you to change your master to somebody else, right? So this may be pointing to another server as a master, but we are telling this server now that I want you to look to another server as a master, right? So that's what we are doing. We are trying to change master to somebody else. Change master to master. Then we have to give the master details, right? What's the master IP address? What's the master username? What's the master password? What's the master's port number? And what's the master's GTID position? Or maybe if you're going to follow this bin log file name, then we need to give the file name and the file position. All those parameters we can give later on, but now our jobs will be easier because we are going to follow the GTID based replication starting from the very first step. So we don't need to worry about the bin log position and bin log file name and all that. Change master to master host equals to single quotes 68.56.71. So that is my host name, and then master port. We know that my port is default. Even if you don't give this port parameter is fine, but just to let you guys know that if you're using a non-standard port, then you need to give this you need to set up the replication this way. So the default port is 3306. I did not change it on the master or this node, so that's why I can give the same. So now you will see that everything that follows here are the details of the new master server, comma master user. So if you remember, we created a user account. Let's see what's the user account. Show create user, replication user at %. Yeah, so this is my user account. So I'll just copy this username as it is, and master user account is going to be in single quotes replication user. Yeah, that's it. So we don't need to give the host name here because that's internal to the server where it's connecting to. So now this machine must have this IP, right? So this number doesn't matter because this we have given as a wildcard. So but this portion should be the same. If this portion is not the same of this on this machine, this replication setup will not work because this node as a slave will not be able to connect to the master. Master will simply reject that this user coming from this host is not authorized to connect to this server, right? And then we already have a master user, and what comes next is of course the master password. So all the parameters are starting with master, right? So master host with the host name, master port is the port number, master user is the username, and master password is of course the password. And we have our super secure password, which is password as well. And the last one we are going to say is all right, so this is something that I'm a bit confused right now. Yeah, it should be master. Yeah, hope I'm right. Master use GTID. Yeah, so we are telling that we want this node to be using GTID to connect to the master, or to request for the replication data. We want this to be using GTID based replication, right? So GTID is equal to, then we will give current position. So now if you remember, we have already set our GTID, our global GTID to empty string, meaning we are telling this server that we don't have a GTID at all. So we are telling when we set up replication that we want you to connect to the master node or to the primary node with the current position. So the current position is what? Current position is empty, right? So that's why we are telling this guy that we want you to send this string as your current GTID to the master node. So the master will know that this guy has an empty GTID, meaning he doesn't have any global transaction ID. So meaning it means that this guy is a new server. So it will start sending all the events starting from the very first event that is available on this machine to this replica node. But keep that in mind, if your server is already a few months old or few days old, you may not have all the binary logs available on this machine. You cannot do this way, right? So you cannot set it up as empty. You cannot do this way. So what's the other way of doing it is to basically take a Maria backup from here, restore this backup on this machine, and then you can use this way and identify your current GTID on the master, right? Or you can get this GTID from your Maria backup folder. So there's one file called extra backup binlog info file on the Maria backup location. You can get the GTID from that folder as well, from that file as well. And then instead of setting it to empty string, you will use that number and set it up through here, right? So within single quotes you will give the GTID, and then later on you will just simply run the same command, but instead of current position you will say slave position, SLAVE POS. So in that case you will do a slave position, right? But for us, current position should be fine. So our change master is done. And if we do so how do you start your slave now? So I am going to start slave this way, very easy. The slave is started. Now is the moment of truth. Let's see, show slave status and \G, and yes, so you see these are the important things. Last error number 0, last error is 0, and then of course this SQL IO running, yes. So your IO thread is running and your SQL thread is also running. So if your replication is broken or stopped, then you would have no here, right? So one of these will be no, as long as these two are showing yes. And then of course your last error number and your last SQL error and the last IO error numbers are empty, it means that your application is working fine. And then of course the most important thing is that your slave is already at this GTID. So which means that your slave has already pulled all the details starting from empty GTID all the way to this GTID, right? So how do you check? Let's say select, not really select, let's say show create user, replication user at 192.168.56.person. So previously, you know that we created this user on this machine, right? So now because of these two transactions that recently are pulled down from our master, we should have this account created on this node as well. And indeed we can see that this user is created locally as well. And now what's the next step? You go to the wirelib MySQL folder and you will see that we have something called a bin log. So we have a binary log that is the bin logs of this own machine. So you remember we enable log slave updates, so that's why we are getting bin logs created on this machine as well. But the important thing is these relay logs. Relay logs are the ones that are basically received from the master to the slave, or from the primary node to the replica node, and then written on the replica node as relay logs. And then those relay logs are applied to the database, and then once that application is done, those transactions are then recorded in its local binary log files. So how do you see the contents of this relay logs? The same concept is MySQL bin log -v for verbose, and then we will do this and we'll just say less, and we should be able to see, yeah, we should be able to see those transactions here if I'm not wrong. Yeah, there you go. So we have this create user, so we know for sure that we got this command through relay log on this machine, and then of course the grant. So yeah, so there you have it. So now we know how to set up a very basic replication setup between a primary and a replica node. And basically this is all there is to replication setup. Now your node is you have a replication going on between two nodes. So let's say if later on you want to add more nodes to the server, so what you will do is you will just simply run the same command again, right? So just simply set your gtid slave position to empty string here and run this command with the same IP address, because our primary node is always going to be 71. So we are replicating from that node to all the other nodes. But in case you want to replicate from this server is 72, right? So what we need to do is we just need to change this guy here. So now we are running this command on another machine with another IP address, and then we are telling that now your master is, or your primary server is this guy, right? So, and start replicating from here. But again, we know that this current position will not work, because most likely you will not have those binary logs that are required to replicate from very first transaction. So what you will have to do is you will have to take a Maria backup from here or from here, and then restore that backup on the other side, and then use that gtid and set it up through this command, and then over here do a slave position. That's it. So simple. All right, so we can see the show slave status. Now we can see that our current transaction ID is set to 2. So what happens if I all right, so let's say if I create, so now I know that I've created a new test database. So if I do show master status, I know my position has changed. My file name is still the same because I haven't restarted the node yet. All right, so I will just run the same command again, and let's say 808, and now you will see that my gtid has moved on to 3. And when I do a show slave status on this node, and there you go, so we can see this guy already replicated that new gtid on this machine, or on this server. So if we see the show database is here, we would see indeed my database is available on this node as well. So there you have it. A very quick test. Let's say create a tab, id serial, and then c1 as. So I have this table created here. Insert into, so my id column is an auto increment column thanks to serial, so it's an auto increment column. So I will just insert data into this column now. So I'm just going to select column name from the information schema.columns table, a data dictionary table, and then just select that bunch of records into this tab 1. Right, so inserted. So we got a lot of records inserted here. So if I do show slave status, you see that my gtid has already moved on to 9, so it's replicating so quickly. Test db. Yep, there is. So we have all those records available on the replica as well already, so quick. Yeah, there you go. All right, so that's all for this video. We did a lot of things here, but you will appreciate it that it's not so difficult. So the only thing important is to basically be able to create a new user account with that replication slave permission or replication slave grant to that user, and then on the slave node or on the replica node, we just simply need to give change master to command, change master to, then master host and master username, and master username is going to be that new user account, and then master password is going to be that password for that user, and then of course the last parameter is your master use gtid master underscore use underscore gtid equals to current position, that current position being an empty string that we already set in advance on the slave node. So from that point onwards, the slave would request or would send that GTID to the master node, to the primary node, saying that my current GTID is this particular string, which is going to be empty for the first time. So the master will know that this guy is a new one, new kid in block. So it will send all the transactions that it has, starting from the very first one to the current position, right? So that's what that current position means. So it would basically get everything that is available on the server. But if, let's say, you want to replicate from a specific position, you don't want to replicate from the very first transaction, let's say, you can always do that. You can just say show, or you can just say, instead of doing a current position, you can just say yeah. So over here you can just say this slave position instead of current position, right? So that's the only difference. But of course, before that, you will have to set your if I have it here, yeah, this guy. So you will have to set your GTID slave position to that specific GTID number from where you want to start replicating. So that's important. So this particularly comes in handy when you already have a server running and you take a backup and then use that backup to rebuild another machine as a replica node. All right, that's all I have for today. Then the next session we are going to have is basically going to see how do you connect these two nodes to a MaxScale server and set up all the read write splitting, auto failover, and all that cool stuff. All right, guys, take care. Enjoy.